My name is Delphine Marchetti, and for 31 years my mother introduced me to her friends as the one who didn't go to law school. That was my whole identity at her dinner parties. Not a person. A correction. A footnote to my younger sister, who did go to law school, who made partner, who married the right kind of man with the right kind of teeth. I learned to smile when she said it. I learned to refill the wine glasses and disappear into the kitchen where the only thing that expected anything of me was a dishwasher. What my mother never knew, what nobody at that long mahogany table in Greenwich knew, was that the woman they pitied had built and sold 2 companies before she turned 30, and that the third one, the quiet one, the one I never talked about, was the reason half the people in that room still had jobs. The night everything cracked open was the night of her 70th birthday, in the ballroom of a private club in Connecticut where the membership fee cost more than most people's cars. I almost didn't go. I want to be honest about that. I sat in my car in the parking lot for 11 minutes with the engine off, watching valets in red vests jog back and forth, and I thought about texting her some lie about a migraine. But I'd spent my whole life being absent in ways nobody noticed, and I was tired. So I walked in. Let me back up, because you can't understand the ballroom without understanding the kitchen table. I grew up in a house where love was a currency you had to earn, and the exchange rate was brutal. My mother, Rosalind, ran the family the way a hedge fund manager runs a portfolio. Constant evaluation, ruthless reallocation, no sentimentality about underperforming assets. And from very early on, she decided I was an underperforming asset. My sister was 3 years younger, polished and quick, the kind of kid who said the clever thing at exactly the right moment. I was the kid who took things apart. Clocks, radios, the garage door opener, once the family computer, which I rebuilt better than it had been but got grounded for anyway because I'd done it without asking. You always have to be difficult, my mother would say, the way other parents say you have such a temper. It wasn't a description, it was a verdict. My father had left when I was 9. I won't pretend that didn't matter. He sends a card every Christmas, the kind with a folded check inside, and his name signed like a stranger's, and I've stopped expecting more. So it was my mother's voice that became the soundtrack of my childhood, and her voice mostly said the same thing in 100 different keys. You are not enough, and you should be embarrassed about it. When I was 16, I built a little piece of software that helped small dry cleaners track inventory. Nothing glamorous. I sold it to a regional chain for $11,000, which to a 16-year-old in 1998 felt like winning the lottery. I came home glowing. I'd printed out the contract. I left it on the kitchen counter, where she'd see it. She read it, set it down, and said, "I hope you're not planning to make a career out of fixing things for laundromats." I went to a state school because she made it clear the family's money, and there was money, old and quiet, was earmarked for my sister's eventual law degree. She has the temperament for it, my mother said, as though temperament were something I'd failed to develop on purpose. So I worked. I coded at night for companies in other time zones. I lived on cereal and the kind of coffee that comes in a can. And somewhere in there, in a sublet apartment with a mattress on the floor, I built my first real company. It was a logistics platform. Boring if you don't understand it. Beautiful if you do. It solved a problem that companies didn't even know they had until I showed them. And it made trucks and warehouses and the whole invisible machinery of American shipping run about 20% leaner. I was 24 when a larger company bought it. I won't say the number. My mother still doesn't know the number, but it was the kind of number that ends a conversation. I told her, of course. I drove up to Greenwich on a Sunday, and I sat at that same kitchen table and I told her I'd sold my company. I remember her hands were folded around a teacup. I remember she didn't put it down. "That's nice," she said. "Have you thought about what you'll do now that you have some free time? You could take a real estate course. Bridget's husband does very well in real estate." I drove home that night and I didn't cry, which surprised me. I think something in me had already begun to harden into the shape it needed to be. I made a decision in that car. I would stop performing for her. I would stop bringing my life to that table like a dog bringing a dead bird to the porch, waiting for praise that would never come. I would simply build, and I would build in silence, and she would never again get to set the value on anything I made. So I disappeared, in a way, not from the family. I still came to the holidays, still sat through the dinners, still got introduced as the one who didn't go to law school, but the real me went underground. Over the next 7 years, I started a second company, a payments infrastructure firm, and sold it too. And then I started the third one, the one that mattered most, and this time I didn't sell it. This time I kept it. It's a company that does disaster logistics. When a hurricane flattens a coastline, when wildfires take a county, when a flood swallows a town in the Midwest. The systems that route water and generators and medical supplies and temporary housing. A lot of those run on software my company built. We work with FEMA. We work with the Red Cross. We work with state agencies in places my mother has never heard of and would never deign to visit. I employ 406 people. I know that number because I signed every offer letter myself, and nobody in my family knew. That was the deal I'd made with myself. They got the polite footnote. The rest was mine. Which brings us back to the ballroom. My sister had organized the birthday party, naturally, because she was the daughter who organized things, and she'd spared no expense, because sparing expense was not in our family's vocabulary. There were maybe 120 people there. My mother's friends, my sister's law firm colleagues, a smattering of Greenwich royalty, a few politicians who came for the open bar. I wore a dark green dress I'd bought specifically because it was understated, because I'd learned that the safest thing to be in my family was unremarkable. I found a spot near the windows and I made myself small, which is a skill I have spent a lifetime perfecting. My mother was holding court at the center table, glowing in the way she always glowed when she was the most important person in a room. My sister sat beside her. There was a chair on my mother's other side, conspicuously empty, with a little place card. I drifted close enough to read it. It had my sister's husband's name on it. I was at table 9, near the kitchen doors, between an elderly cousin who couldn't hear and an empty seat. I want to tell you I didn't care. I'd be lying. The dinner went the way these dinners go. Toasts. Laughter that was a little too loud. My sister stood and gave a speech about our mother that made her sound like a cross between Mother Teresa and a Fortune 500 CEO. And everyone applauded, and my mother dabbed at her eyes with a napkin in a gesture so practiced it could have been choreographed. Then she stood up to thank everyone, and she went around the room acknowledging people. The senator's wife, her bridge group. My sister, her greatest achievement. And then her eyes found me at table 9 and something flickered across her face. Not warmth. Calculation. And of course my other daughter is here, she said into the microphone. And the room turned to look at me. Delphine. She's the creative one. A pause, perfectly timed. Still figuring things out, aren't you, sweetheart? The laughter was soft and indulgent. The laughter people give to a joke they don't fully understand. But trust is appropriate. I felt my face go hot. I was 41 years old. I ran a company that had kept families alive during the worst weeks of their lives, and my mother had just told a ballroom full of strangers that I was still figuring things out. I smiled. God help me, I smiled. And I might have gone the rest of my life smiling, except for what happened next. There was a man at table 3 I hadn't noticed before. Tall, gray at the temples, a quiet kind of presence that didn't fit the room. The kind of person who has spent his life in rooms far more dangerous than this one and has stopped needing to perform in them. He'd been invited, I'd later learn, because he sat on a charitable board with one of my mother's friends. His name was August Vandermeer, and he was the deputy administrator of the federal agency that handles national disaster response. He stood up during the lull after my mother's speech, the way a person stands when they've been turning something over and finally decided to say it. He was looking at me. I'm sorry, he said, and the room quieted because his voice had the particular weight of a man not used to being interrupted. I didn't put it together until just now. The name, the face. He paused. You're Marchetti. As in Meridian Resilient Systems. I felt the floor tilt. Nobody connected my name to that company. We were deliberately quiet. We didn't do press. I didn't have a public face by design. I'm sorry, my mother said into the microphone, with the bright, confused smile of someone whose script has gone off the rails. I think you may have the wrong 3 years ago, August went on, ignoring her completely, still looking at me. There was a Category 4 that came up the Gulf and stalled over a coastline for 2 days. 300,000 people without power. The local water treatment failed. We had supplies, but we couldn't move them. The routing was a disaster, no pun intended. We were watching a humanitarian catastrophe form in real time. He shook his head slowly, like the memory still cost him something. And then a system came online that nobody on my staff had ever seen before. It rerouted everything. It found roads we didn't know were passable. It got water trucks to a dialysis center in a town we'd written off 20 minutes before the generators there failed. He looked at me, and his voice dropped. I lost a lot of sleep that year, trying to figure out who built that. We were told the founder didn't want to be named. The room was dead silent now. I could hear the kitchen doors swinging behind me, the clink of someone setting down a tray. That was you, he said. It wasn't a question. I have replayed the next few seconds more times than I can count. My mother's face, the way the color drained out of it, the way water drains out of a sink, all at once, a swirl, and then nothing. My sister's mouth slightly open. The senator's wife leaning toward her husband and whispering something. 120 faces, all of them recalibrating, all of them looking at the woman at table 9 they'd been told was still figuring things out. I could have let it pass. I'd let 1,000 smaller moments pass. But I was so tired of being the footnote. I stood up. Yes, I said. My voice was steadier than I expected. That was my company. We had a system in beta, and we deployed it without authorization because waiting for the paperwork would have killed people. I looked at August. I think we got water to about 11,000 homes that week. We lost 2 trucks to flooding. No drivers, thank God. You saved that dialysis center, he said quietly. I have the after-action report. I've read it maybe 40 times. We got lucky, I said. The road held. It wasn't luck, he said. It was the routing. And then he did something I will remember on my deathbed. This man, who answered to a cabinet secretary, who had stood in the wreckage of a dozen American disasters, walked across that ballroom in front of everyone, and he put out his hand, and he said, Ms. Marchetti, it is an honor. I have wanted to shake your hand for 3 years. I shook it. I was aware of my mother's eyes on me, of the microphone still in her hand, of the silence stretching like something about to tear. I don't understand, my mother said finally, and for the first time in my entire life, I heard uncertainty in her voice. Delphine works in. She does something with computers. She's never said anything about she runs Meridian Resilience Systems, August said, turning to her with a polite coolness that I'd later realize was him being kind. It's one of the most important pieces of infrastructure in the country's emergency response apparatus. Most people in my field consider your daughter one of the most consequential engineers of her generation. He glanced back at me. I assumed her family knew. The silence that followed that sentence was the loudest thing I have ever heard. My mother set the microphone down on the table. Her hand was trembling slightly. I'd never seen her hand tremble. Of course we knew, she said, but it came out thin, and everyone heard the lie in it, and the worst part, the part I almost felt sorry for, was that she heard it too. My sister recovered first, the way lawyers do. Delphine, you never said, she managed, with a brightness that didn't reach her eyes. Why didn't you ever say? And here is the thing I had never understood until that exact moment. Standing in a green dress between the kitchen doors and the windows, with 120 people watching, I hadn't kept it secret because I was modest. I'd kept it secret because some small, stubborn child in me had been waiting, for years, for decades, for them to value me without being told what I was worth by an outside authority. I'd wanted them to see me. Just me, not the title, not the company, not the federal administrator vouching for me in a ballroom. And they never had. They never would have. They needed a stranger to tell them I mattered before they could see it. Because you never asked, I said to my sister. My voice didn't shake. In 41 years, not one of you ever asked me a single real question about my life. You decided who I was when I was a child, and you never once updated the file. I turned to my mother. She was looking at me, and her face had done something I'd never seen it do. It had cracked. Underneath the composure, there was just an old woman at her birthday party realizing that she had spent 4 decades being wrong about her own child, in public with witnesses. Mom, I said, and I was surprised by how gentle it came out. You've spent my whole life introducing me as the daughter who didn't measure up. I let you because I thought one day I'd do something big enough that you'd have to stop. I shook my head. But there's no number big enough. There never was. The problem was never that I hadn't done enough. The problem was that you'd already decided. I picked up my purse from table 9. I'm going to go, I said. Happy birthday. I mean that. I walked toward the doors. The crowd did that thing crowds do when they part for someone. They pulled back just slightly, and I understood for the first time that the thing that made them step aside wasn't the company or the title or the man from FEMA. It was that I had finally stopped asking permission to take up space. August caught me near the coat check. He gave me his card, told me his office had been trying to reach Meridian about a contract for the upcoming hurricane season, that the formal channels kept hitting a wall because we were so deliberately invisible. We talked for 10 minutes about logistics, about prepositioning supplies, about a flooding model I'd been working on. It was the most seen I had felt in that entire building, and I'd met the man 20 minutes earlier. My mother called me 4 days later. I almost didn't pick up. I looked up your company, she said. No hello. That was very her. I didn't know it was so. I didn't know. I know you didn't, I said. There was a long pause. I could hear her breathing. Your sister says I owe you an apology. I don't want one you have to be told to give, I said. Another pause, longer. And then, quietly, in a voice I almost didn't recognize because I'd never heard her use it on me. I'm sorry, Delphine. I think I was afraid of you. You were always so much more than the rest of us, and I didn't know what to do with that, so I made you smaller. It was easier than admitting I didn't understand you. I sat down on my kitchen floor with my back against the cabinets. I'd waited my whole life to hear something like that, and now that it had come, it felt smaller than I'd imagined, the way a mountain looks smaller once you've climbed it. But it was real. I could tell it was real because it cost her something to say. Thank you, I said. That means a lot. We've talked more since then. Not constantly. The damage of 40 years doesn't dissolve in one phone call, and I'd be lying if I told you we've become close. But she started asking questions. Small ones, at first. What does your company actually do? How many people work there? Were you scared when you started it? And I've answered them carefully, the way you'd hand something fragile to someone who's broken your things before. We're building something new on the rubble of the old thing. It's slow. It's honest. It's enough. I went back to the office the Monday after the party, and I signed 3 new offer letters. And I read every name out loud to myself the way I always do, because each one is a person who decided to trust me with their livelihood. And I thought about the 16-year-old who sold a piece of software to a laundromat and brought the contract home like a trophy, hoping. I wished I could reach back and tell her something. I'd tell her this. Your worth is not a verdict that someone else gets to deliver. It's not the introduction your mother gives at a dinner party. It's not the title on your business card or the stranger who vouches for you in a ballroom. Those things are nice, but they are not the thing. The thing is what you build when no one is clapping. The thing is the 406 people and the dialysis center and the road that held. The thing is that you kept going in the dark for years with no applause because the work mattered even when no one knew your name. I spent 4 decades waiting for my mother to hand me my value like a gift. She never did, and she never could, because it was never hers to give. It was mine the whole time. It always had been. I just had to stop waiting at that table and stand up and walk out into a life I'd built with my own 2 hands. My name is Delphine Marchetti. I am the founder and chief executive of a company that helps people survive the worst days of their lives. And I am, finally, done figuring things out. For a long time, I believed the math was simple. If I built something big enough, my mother would finally have to see me. So I kept adding to the pile. 1 company, then a second, then 406 people who trusted me with their livelihoods. As if value were a number you could stack high enough to be visible from the front table. The night of that gala taught me the equation was wrong from the start. No total was ever going to move her, because she'd settled the verdict when I was a child and stopped checking the work. The cause of my 40 years of waiting wasn't that I'd done too little. It was that I'd handed her the pen and let her keep writing. What actually changed nothing and everything that night came down to 3 things I'd been building quietly the whole time without naming them. The first was the choice I made in a parked car at 24, when I decided I would build in silence rather than perform for applause that would never come. That was a decision about character, about doing the work because it mattered, not because someone was clapping. The dialysis center didn't get its water because I wanted credit. It got water because I'd built a thing that worked when it counted, and I deployed it without authorization knowing it might cost me because people were going to die. You don't get to that moment by chasing approval. You get there by deciding early what kind of person you're going to be when no one is watching. The second was the long, patient learning, the nights coding for companies in other time zones, the failures I rebuilt better, the willingness to understand a problem so deeply that I could see the road that held when everyone else had written it off. Nobody handed me that. I had to be curious enough and honest enough about what I didn't know to earn it. The third was the plain refusal to quit. Cereal and canned coffee years, a mattress on the floor, a mother who called my first contract a laundromat job. I kept going through all of it not because I was sure it would pay off, but because stopping would have meant letting her be right about me. That stubbornness, the thing she called difficult when I was a child, turned out to be the most valuable thing she ever accidentally gave me. Here is what I'd tell anyone still sitting at a table waiting to be seen. Your worth was never theirs to assign. Build the character that acts right in the dark, sharpen the mind that learns what no one will teach you, and keep the spine that refuses to fold. And one day you'll realize you stopped needing the verdict at all. Rosalind needed a stranger to tell her I mattered before she could see it. I don't fault her for that anymore, but I'll never again wait at that table. I stood up. I always could have. I just finally did.